Synthetic a priori after type theory. Kant, Martin-Löf, and the transformation of identity in homotopy type theory. One, before moving forward, I want to just say something that perhaps, my apologies, my camera is off. Uh, Say something that might be, beneficial to those people who do not know that much of the Kant's jargon and parlance. So, in the work of Kant, synthetic a priori pertains to claims that extend knowledge. They are not just by unpacking word meanings. These are knowable and independently of particular experience. They are possible because the mind does not merely record facts, rather, it contributes basic organizing rules and forms, the organ of of a structuration, so to speak. The way objects must be structured for any experience or measurement to count as experience at all and to begin with. Mathematics, and for Kant, parts of fundamental science works this way. It teaches something new to us, right? In the way of the modern philosophy, but under constraints built into the very condition of possibility of cognition, not by sampling the world case by case. So, thus begins Section 1, the problem, synthetic a priori without prior nostalgia. So, the proposal to join Immanuel Kant's transcendental philosophy to homotopy type theory often begins with an intuitive, rather kitsch appeal. Kant claims that mathematics is synthetic a priori because it proceeds by construction, hot, HOTT, which is an acronym for homotopy type theory, treats existence and truth as requiring constructions. Therefore, hot looks like a contemporary formalization of what Kant called construction in pure intuition. The difficulty is not that this line of thought is rather empty, it's that it remains way too easy for wishy-washy analogies. And Kant's transcendental project is not, after all, an analogical enterprise. It is a project of identifying the condition or the conditions under which judgment can count as objectively valid conditions that are neither empirical generalization nor metaphysical postulates. A defensible Kant-Hot connection must therefore be located where Kant himself locates philosophical necessity in the organon of modern philosophizing, in the forms and norms of judging, so to speak. The question becomes then less does homotopy type theory resemble Kant's story about intuition, and more does type theory and homotopy type theory in particular provide an explicit architecture of judgment and objecthood that can be read as a modern locus for something like the synthetic a priori. This is exactly where Per Martin-Löf classic paper, Analytic and Synthetic Judgments in Type Theory, becomes indispensable. Martin-Löf does not merely cite Kant as a historical curiosity. He argues that type theory can be described by displaying the forms of judgment it employs. And he offers a reconstruction of the analytic synthetic distinction internal to the judgment forms. Per Martin-Löf's paper then draws a further philosophical consequence, which amounts to the questions of decidability, incompleteness, and the limits of formal calculi, which track the boundary between the analytic core and the synthetic frontier. Once that hinge is in place, homotopy type theory can be incorporated without much romantic overstretching. Hot, then, does not restore Kant's 18th century aesthetic, and it does not convert transcendental idealism into a thesis about spaces, so to speak, right? We know what spaces in Kant's are. Its philosophical interest lies elsewhere. It recognizes the identity condition of objects within a constructive framework. If Kantian objectivity is bound up with rules that unify a manifold of presentations into something that can be judged as one and the same, homotopy type theory proposes a new internal calculus for such unity, one in which identity is evidence bearing and structurally transportable under the worked out appellation of the so-called equivalence. After all, homotopy type theory is, for those of you who don't know, are unfamiliar with this, homotopy type theory is essentially a mixture of homotopy, a topological, discipline, and type theory, essentially per Martin-Löf. So homotopy is a very brutal discipline of mathematics. It's probably the most discipline. People usually talk shit about Al-Khwarizmi, you know, the founder, the father of algebra, for his brutalist manner. And those of us who have worked with algebraic formulations, we know exactly how algebra works in the sense of how we الجبر والمقابلة, face off in Arabic and equivalation. So obviously, homotopy is part of algebraic topology. So, but in a most brutal sense, it it really genuinely asks us. For example, we have different sorts of topological spaces, or basically it wants to tell us that look, you can up to a continuous deformation, up to a continuous deformation, you can collapse the dimensions of every mathematical object from three-dimensional to two-dimensional to zero-dimensional. And if this holds, there would be a certain sort of equivalence, underlying equivalence or correspondence among every mathematical object that we ever did, we created. Type theory here is something else, and this is what I'm going to, mention. That why is that per Martin-Löf addition of type theory to homotopy, which is an algebraic topological discipline is fundamentally important. So the aim of this talk is to articulate that connection in a way that respects both Kant's method and the distinctive contribution of Martin-Löf's judgments analysis. Section 2, Kant's synthetic a priori, construction as norm, not psychology. Kant's claim that mathematics yields synthetic a priori knowledge is often summarized as if it were a thesis about private mental imagery. And some people want to go that route. Such summaries, unfortunately, invite a quick dismissal. Modern mathematics does not rest on a faculty of intuition in the ordinary sense, and Kant's association of pure intuition with Euclidean space seems historically dated, at least according to academic papers. Yet Kant's best point survives this so-called caricature. The core insight is that mathematical knowledge is ampliative and necessary because it depends on a rule-governed procedure that produces its object and thereby provides the ground of its judgments. Of course, we can talk about what do we mean by judgments, but not for now. In mathematics, the object is not merely assumed, but it is made available through a construction that is governed by rules and carried out under constraints that are not empirical. This is why Kant treats construction as a decisive mark of mathematical cognition. An analytic judgment can be justified by unpacking what is already contained in the concept. A synthetic judgment, by contrast, extends knowledge and requires that something be added, hence ampliative dimension. In mathematics, what is added is not an empirical observation, but a construction in pure intuition. The function of this phrase is to insist that the added element is constrained according to Kant, by a priori forms. Yet, this is not an arbitrary invention, and it is not, by any definition, an empirical discovery either. Necessity of mathematical knowledge is secured by semantic containment, is not secured by semantic containment, by the normative, but by the normative structure of the constructive procedure, which is a program itself. Now, you might say that, Reza, what do you mean by program? I really mean computer program here. Right. And of course, I'm going to get into Curry Howard correspondence. Kant's transcendental logic generalizes its stance. The central question is not what exists, but what must be presupposed for judgments to have objective purport. Kant famously takes a clue from general logic. He suggests that by examining the forms of judgment, one can articulate the basic ways in which thought relates representations to an object. Categories on this approach are not empirical concepts and not metaphysical predicates attached to a ready-made world. They are conditions of possible experience and possible object-directed judgment. Whether one accepts Kant's specific list is less important than recognizing the method implicated here. that objectivity is grounded in rules of synthesis that can be traced in the forms of judging. The Kant type theory connection becomes plausible precisely here, a foundational framework that makes explicit the forms and norms of judgment, and that links objectivity to constructive availability, would represent a natural contemporary site for the Kantian Transcendental project. Type theory, especially in Martin-Löf presentation, does exactly that. Section 3. Martin-Löf, the analytic synthetic distinction, as distinction of judgment forms. Martin-Löf begins by insisting that type theory can be most easily described by exhibiting directly the forms of judgment that it employs, that it is already a methodological alignment with Kant, albeit entered from a weird type theoretical backdoor. Philosophical clarity is achieved by laying out the forms of judging rather than by stipulating an ontology. The basic judgment form he takes as fundamental include the typing judgment. A colon alpha simply means A is a term of type alpha. And the definition identity judgment, A equals B colon alpha, which is to say, A and B are identical by definition as terms of type alpha. Definitional identity is not merely a claim that two expressions denote the same thing, but rather it is an equality born out of judgment that is governed by the computational and definitional rules of the system itself. The Kantian resonance is fully explicit here. Martin-Löf notes that in the judgment A colon alpha, A falls under the type alpha, Kant would have said category instead of type. And he draws attention to Kant's link between categories of and forms of judgment. Martin-Löf then proposes a striking thesis which follows as such. These coupled judgment forms, together with their rules, can serve as a modern analog of Kant's metaphysical deduction of categories. The categories in play are not metaphysical predicates, however, anymore. They are fundamental judgmental forms that determine what counts as an object of discourse within a possible system or a universe of discourse. The crucial step for the Kant homotopy type theory story is Martin-Löf's reconstruction of the analytic synthetic distinction. He introduces an existential form. Alpha exists and defines its meaning through an inference. From A colon alpha, A, falls under the type alpha, one may infer alpha exists. So the existential what you might call to be punchline is that when Martin-Löf says that A inhabits the type alpha, and then from there we can infer that alpha exists. When he says something like that, he's not Persian. He wants to say that if we have made a term for an alpha type, then obviously if we can create an existential, a particular existential dictum for alpha or A, this means that we are supposed to what? To create or construct, let's say not create, construct a witness for the existence of alpha, of the object alpha. This is this is revolutionary. This is the whole idea that Kant has always been talking about. That, when we say that X exists, what do we mean? Really, genuinely, what do we mean when we say X exists in philosophy or in logic? And I know that these are not fully in correspondence, these two statements in philosophy and logic. But nevertheless, is Per Martin-Löf wants to say that yes, there is a fundamental equivalence between such a statements. Because if you say X exists as a certain sort of object, you should be able to construct the witness of such objectivity. In other words, an existence judgment is warranted by the availability of a witness, a construction of an object of the relevant type. This ties existence to construction in a way that maps naturally onto Kant's insistence that mathematics proceeds by construction. The existential judgment is synthetic in the sense that it is evidence, is not secured solely by meaning. It requires that a construction be provided. And of course, this construction is often a program or a proof. The same pattern is extended to proposition. If A is a proposition, one can consider the type proof of A, of its proofs and form the existential judgment proof A exists. Martin-Löf remarks that intuitionistically, truth is defined as the existence of a proof or construction of the proposition. This is not a mere terminological shift. It relocates the notion of truth from a semantic relation to a constructive one. That is to say, its aim is to assert truth, is to assert the existence of evidence. And the evidence is itself an object that must be constructed. Right? So the Kantian moral is stated with unusual directness here. Analytic judgments rest on meaning and definitional identity. Synthetic judgments, including existent judgments, rest on construction. Moreover, Martin-Löf stresses a dependence structure. Synthetic judgments are grounded on analytic ones, in the sense that a synthetic judgment can be obtained by suppressing the object from an analytic judgment. The judgment alpha type exists, suppresses the witness A being falling under type alpha, leaving an existential claim whose correctness depends on the availability of some witness, but not on any particular one being presented in the judgment itself. This distinction does not merely classify statements, it diagnoses where the work of mathematics truly happens. The analytic core is checkable. The synthetic frontier requires construction. In a Kantian key, the synthetic a priori becomes visible as the structured space between decidable judgmental infrastructure and open-ended constructive production that should be always kept in check. Section 4, decidability, incompleteness, and transcendental boundary within formal practice. Martin-Löf discussion culminates in a claim that is especially fruitful for contemporary Kantian reading. The analytic synthetic distinction, he says, is crucial for understanding incompleteness and undecidability in logical calculi. The logic of analytic judgment is complete and decidable, while the logic of synthetic judgment is incomplete and undecidable. The heart of the point is rather simple. Typing and definitional equality are governed by rules that can be checked mechanically. The system's computational character supports a type checking algorithm. And Martin-Löf actually talks about this quite explicitly. By contrast, existent judgments and truth as existence of proof require the production of witness, and searching for such witnesses need not terminate. This diagnosis has both computational and philosophical significance of utmost degree. Computationally, it explains why proof assistants can verify a proposed proof while being unable in general to find a proof from scratch. Philosophically, it articulates a boundary internal to rational practice, the conditions of objective judging, including a constructive dimension that cannot be reduced to a globally decidable procedure. The synthetic a priori, in this sense, is neither a metaphysical privilege nor a psychological mystery. It is the structural fact that the objective claims in mathematics depend on construction that are constrained by a priori rules yet remain open-ended in their production. This is a point at which Kant can be read with renewed clarity. Kant does not claim that mathematics is necessary because it's obvious. He claims it's necessary because it is generated under a priori constraints by a rule-governed construction. Martin-Löf shows how a modern foundational framework can encode this structure in its very grammar of judgment. The transcendental aspect is not an external metaphysics to be smuggled in. It is the internal articulation of the norms by which objecthood and truth are constituted in the practice itself. So, I know that we are running short on time, so I'm going to not read section 5, section 6 and 7, but going to go jump to section 7, I think precisely because we have talked about certain main issues here, right? And maybe I should actually say this, that homotopy type theory inherits the so-called Trinitarian spirit, right? Uh, to use Robert Harper's terminology, that with regard to Howard Carey Lambeck isomorphism or correspondence, that all of these computer programs the structure of model, even though Lambeck is quite model theoretic within, his understanding of language. So model theoretic understanding of structure of language and also a structure of mathematics. That these three, uh, what you might call to be procedures, according to Robert Harper, are manifestations of one single spirit, God itself, right? So, sure, homotopy type theory inherits this Trinitarian background, but also pushes it further by internalizing identity and equivalence as first-class objects of reasoning. Univalence can be situated against this horizon as a principle that upgrades a structural equivalence into usable identity as evidence within a universe of types. So that translation across different presentations, right, is no longer merely an external meta-theoretical maneuver, but becomes an operation governed by rules inside the theory. The result is a sharpened picture of the language logic mathematics nexus, not three separate domains stitched together after the fact, but three aspects of a single economy of construction and justification, in which equivalence authorizes transport and thereby stabilize objectivity. Now, of course, people usually want to talk about Curry-Howard correspondence, but I think the Lambeck, uh, because it's usually Curry-Howard-Lambeck correspondence. But people usually don't want to talk about Lambeck, and of course I understand because of its model theoretic um, ideas. So the Lambic component is often introduced through model theoretic or semantic consideration, and this can seem to strain a Kantian emphasis on normativity if semantics is understood as neutral account of satisfaction. Yet categorical semantics can also be read as a disciplined theory of translation. It specifies which transformations preserve compositional structure and inferential rule, thereby providing criteria for when two presentations count as the same for the purpose of reasoning and justification. In this light, Nelson Goodman's thought that cognition can be renewed through systematic redescription gains a precise analog within homotopy type theory and Curry-Howard-Lambeck correspondence. Distinct world versions, such as Ptolemaic and Copernican astronomy, or Newtonian and relativistic mechanics, need not be pictured as mere competitors for a single description. They can be understood as rearticulations related by constrained equivalences that preserve what is explanatorily and inferentially significant while redistributing what counts as rather primitive. The formal stress that homotopy type theory places on transport across equivalences thus resonates with the project of world making, not as a celebration of arbitrariness, but as a study of the condition under which redescription remains objectively accountable. 7. The logic of space and the status of intuition in Kant. The slogan of homotopy type theory is a logic of space has proven philosophically suggestive, but it is also in wide a category mistake if it is used to equate homotopical space with Kant's form of outer intuition. Kant's space is not a mathematical object among other. It is a priori form under which outer objects can be given. Homotopy type theory, however, in that sense, spaces are, in the first instance, internal mathematical structures, often motivated by topological semantics and higher categorical interpretations. The Kantian use of homotopy type theory, therefore, requires a very disciplined translation. The translation should not claim that homotopy type theory recovers Kant's aesthetic. It should claim that homotopy type theory provides an internalization of a spatialized reasoning about identity. Paths, homotopies, and higher identifications become part of the object language, and objecthood is articulated through the structure of identification. In this sense, homotopy type theory can be said to spatialize identity without making any direct claim about human sensibility. The philosophical gain is that the manifold and its synthesis, central to Kant's story about objectivity, acquires a precise formal analog in a manifold of identifications and the rules governing their identity. So I'm going to just jump to the last section. Uh, Sorry, I had written also some stuff about William Lovere and so on and so forth, but I think that we are we need to wrap this up. So
Oh,
section 9.
Reza, would you be able to send me your text after?
Absolutely, absolutely. I
Oh,
will.
good.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank
Section
you.
9. What the Kant type theory link is not phenomenon and nomenon. It is tempting to assimilate the constructivist character of type theory to Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, treating types as appearances and some external intended model as things in themselves. This temptation should be resisted by all means possible. Kant's nomenon is not a hidden entity that one might eventually disclose in a fashion of the Heidegger, the procedure of disclosure and aletheia and that all that sort of stuff. It's a boundary concept that marks the limits of possible experience of legitimate application of the categories. Type theory, type theories, meta theory, or model theory does not play the same role. It is a semantic perspective on the system, not a metaphysical behind the scenes reality. A more defensible Kantian boundary in this context is the one Martin-Löf identifies. That is, the boundary between the analytic, decidable layer and the synthetic, constructive layer. This boundary is not metaphysical, it is internal to rational practice itself. It marks what can be checked versus what must be constructed. And it explains why no fixed formal calculus can exhaust the space of constructive mathematical truths. In that sense, the limit is not beyond appearances, but within the very structure of object directed judgings. The thing in itself does not need to be imported to obtain a transcendental morale at the end of the day. The moral already arises from the internal condition of evidential objectivity, namely the construction of a veritable witness. Kant's transcendental project seeks conditions under which judgments can be about objects. In mathematics, Kant locates a distinctive condition in construction under a priori constraints. Martin-Löf provides a contemporary construction of this insight as a level of judgment forms. Analytic judgments are governed by definitional identity and type checking, while synthetic judgments, including existence and truth, are grounded in constructions. The boundary between these layers tracks the boundary between decidability and open-endedness, and thereby illuminates incompleteness and undecidability as structural facts about rational practice rather than merely as technical computational curiosities. Homotopy type theory inherits this judgment architecture and extends it by internalizing and enriching the structure of identity. Identity becomes an evidence bearing object. The manifold of identification is organized by rules of transport. Univalence provides a principled method for generating identity, evidence from equivalence, and thereby enforces a structural criterion of sameness or isomorphism. In this way, homotopy type theory can be read as a transformation of the constitutive norms of objectivity within mathematics. It does not revive Kant's aesthetics, but it does reactivate the Kantian method itself. Begin from the forms and norms of judging and articulate objecthood through the rules of synthesis rather than through metaphysical stipulation. In that humble move, we inhabit so many world versions, a la Nelson Goodman, alien or not. The motto of transcendental mathematics is that in the very organons of structurations of the world, and thus that which counts as intelligible, we still need to do much work. If cognition, mathematical or otherwise, is foundational to the problems at hand, then we must recognize, that is to say, cognize anew the very organons of cognition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reza.